The old house leaned against the horizon like a weary pilgrim who had walked too long beneath the sun. Its timbers groaned when the wind pressed against them, and its roof lines sagged like the shoulders of a man who had carried grief for far too many winters. Windows, once bright as lantern eyes, were cracked and dulled by years of sandstorms. Hinges screeched when touched. The porch was crooked, half sunken into the earth, and yet in that stillness, in that ruin, there lived a quiet dignity. The land around it stretched wide, an ocean of dust and thorn, where the prairie grass had long since given way to weeds. Coyotes cried out at night, their voices thin and echoing, as if even they mourned what the ranch had become. And so it was, on a wind-chapped morning, that the rancher and his daughter stood before the house they had inherited. The father was not old, but years of work and loss had etched themselves into his face. Lines dug deep across his brow, his skin browned and leathered by sun, his hands calloused from rope and plow. He stood tall out of habit, not out of strength. Beside him, the daughter. She carried herself with a quiet resilience that no one seemed to see. Her hair pulled back with rough hands, her clothes simple, patched, and worn. Her eyes, clear as river water, studied the broken ranch not with despair, but with the strange tenderness of someone who could still imagine what others could not. The townsfolk had warned them. They had laughed, their voices sharp and cutting like the crack of a whip. That place is nothing but bones. You'd be better off tearing it down. Sell the land if you can. Ain't nothing left there but ghosts. The words carried across the churchyard after Sunday sermons, and in the saloon when men leaned against polished counters with whiskey on their tongues. Even women, in their gathered skirts, whispered behind gloved hands as the rancher and his girl walked past. It wasn't the first time they had been mocked, and it would not be the last. But each word landed like a pebble in the father's chest, adding weight to a burden already too heavy to carry. He remembered the ranch when it had been whole, when his father, her grandfather, had ridden the fence lines proud, when the cattle roamed thick on the grass, when the name of their family had meant something. Now it meant nothing but pity or worse, ridicule. He turned his face away from his daughter, ashamed of the broken house that was all he could give her. But she saw something else. The sun rose slow that morning, painting the sky in long strokes of pink and amber, and when the light touched the broken windows, they caught fire for a moment. The glass, cracked though it was, glimmered like stained glass in a cathedral. She smiled softly, almost to herself. "Maybe it ain't the end," she whispered. The father heard her, though he pretended he had not. They walked through the house. The boards creaked beneath their boots. Dust rose in golden clouds, turning the sunlight into pillars that reached down like heaven's fingers. Here had been the kitchen, once warm with bread and coffee, now empty but for a broken chair and the rusted handle of an iron stove. Here, the parlor, where laughter once rolled like thunder, now echoing hollow as they passed. Every room was a reminder of what had been lost. The daughter trailed her hands across the walls. She touched the places where wallpaper peeled, where time had carved its initials. She felt the wounds of the house like they were her own, and in that touch there was reverence, almost a promise. In the upstairs bedroom, she opened a drawer swollen with damp and time. Inside lay scraps, a pocket knife dulled with use, a faded handkerchief embroidered with a name nearly rubbed away, a key without a lock. She held it in her palm, the iron cool against her skin, and for reasons she could not explain, she slipped it into her apron pocket. That evening, they sat on the porch, the father with his hat low over his eyes, the daughter with her gaze on the horizon. The town was just beyond the ridge, its lamps beginning to glow as night crept in. They could almost hear the laughter carried by wind, the laughter that said fools, both of them clinging to dust. The father's voice came low, waited. Maybe they're right. Maybe it's too far gone. The daughter turned, her eyes steady, her voice soft but unshakable. "We got more than walls, Pa. We got roots. And roots don't die easy." He did not answer. His silence was heavy, but her words lingered. The days that followed were filled with labor. They patched what they could, hammered where it still held firm, dragged away the worst of the rotted boards. It was thankless work, and the heat bore down without mercy. Sometimes, when the father faltered, the daughter took the tools in her own hands. Her palms blistered and bled, yet she pressed on. She worked not for the house as it was, but for what it might become. The townsfolk came to watch. They leaned on fence rails, chuckling at the sight. "Like patching up a corpse," one man muttered. "Girl don't know when to quit," said another. And the laughter rose again, light and cruel as dust devils in summer. The father tried to block it out, but each word stung. The daughter only lowered her head and kept working. Inside her chest, a flame had caught, the kind of flame that mockery cannot snuff out, that grows brighter the more the wind tries to blow it away. At night, when the air cooled, they sat again by lamplight. The father's hands trembled from weariness. The daughter's shoulders ached. If she wrote by candle glow in a small leather journal she kept hidden in her skirts. She wrote not of ruin, but of possibility. She wrote as if speaking to the land itself, whispering secrets into the paper. Words of faith, words of hope. And sometimes, when she closed the book and set it aside, her hand would brush against the iron key in her pocket. She would wonder what door it had once opened, what lock it still might. Something told her the house had not given up all its secrets yet. And so the rancher and his daughter remained, mocked but unmoved. The broken ranch stood silent around them, its scars laid bare, its timbers groaning in the night wind. But beneath that ruin, beneath the dust and derision, something waited, like a seed buried deep, unseen by all but those patient enough to believe in it. And she believed. The days began to bleed into one another. Morning rose with a pale sky, faded and thin like old muslin. Noon burned hard, leaving sweat on their brows and dust on their tongues. Evening settled heavy, wrapping them in silence, broken only by the creak of boards and the far-off call of night birds. Life at the ranch was little more than a rhythm of survival. Fix this, mend that, haul water from a well that coughed more air than it did drink. Cook beans slow over the fire until their skins split. Sleep on cots that sagged like weary backs. The house was still broken, though patched. The wind still found its way through the cracks, whistling soft laments through the rafters. Yet in the daughter's eyes there was a strange, persistent fire. She worked until her hands split, until blood streaked her palms like war paint. She worked with a kind of quiet ferocity, as though she were arguing with the house itself. You will stand again. You will not fall on my watch. But for the father, each passing day pressed heavier. His shoulders stooped lower. His voice grew quieter. He had buried dreams before. He knew what it felt like to lose. And though he admired the girl's resolve, he could not rid himself of the gnawing thought that perhaps the townsfolk were right. The town never let them forget. On market days, they came with their wagon, rattling, patched, one wheel wobbling. They brought eggs when the hens were kind, a few vegetables from a stubborn garden, and sometimes little more than hope that someone would trade fair. But the townsfolk were not kind. Men leaned on fence posts as they passed, shaking their heads. Women whispered, their words sharp enough to slice. Children pointed, repeating the taunts of their parents. The father felt each look like a stone thrown at his chest. He tried to shield his daughter from it, but she saw. She heard. At the saloon, laughter followed them through swinging doors. "That house'll collapse for the years out," said one man, lifting his glass. "Shame they cling so tight to nothing," said another. And the girl, stubborn as a mule, but mules don't plow with pride. The daughter stood tall, though her cheeks burned. She did not reply. She simply gathered supplies, nails, lamp oil, a sack of flour, and walked back out beneath the open sky. But inside her chest, the fire grew. One evening, the first man came. He was a wealthy rancher, broad-shouldered, well-dressed, with boots polished to a shine and spurs that jingled when he walked. He carried himself like a man who had never known want, like one who believed every acre of land bent to his will. He leaned against the warped railing of their porch, hat tilted back, smile sharp as a knife. "You two are wasting your breath," he said. "That house ain't worth the sweat you're spilling on it." The father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The man's gaze slid toward the daughter. His smile widened, cruel, amused. Best thing you could do is sell. I'll give you coin enough to set yourself somewhere decent. You ain't made for this. Girl's too young, too soft, to be playing rancher. The daughter's eyes hardened, though her voice stayed even. This house was my grandfather's. His blood's in these walls. We're not selling. The man chuckled low, shaking his head as if at a child. Stubborn, just like he was. But pride don't feed a table, sweetheart. Remember that when winter bites. With that, he tipped his hat mockingly and strode back to his fine horse, leaving dust and the sting of his words behind. The father sat in silence long after he was gone. The daughter, though, did not falter. She placed her hand on the old porch post, steady as stone. We'll make it stand, she whispered again. It was the next day that the stranger appeared. He came walking down the road on foot, dust clinging to his boots, coat faded from travel. His hat shadowed most of his face, but when he lifted his head, there was nothing mocking in his eyes. No smirk, no sneer, just a steady calm, like still water in a hidden spring. He stopped by the fence where the father and daughter wrestled with sagging rails. Need a hand? He asked. His voice was low, unhurried, carrying the weight of a man who had learned not to waste words. The father glanced at him, suspicious but too weary to argue. Fence don't fix itself, he muttered. The stranger set down his pack and joined them. His hands were strong, practiced. He drove nails straight, lifted rails with ease. He did not boast, did not lecture, did not laugh. He simply worked alongside them until the fence stood truer than it had in years. When it was done, he brushed the dust from his palms and gave a small nod. Good earth here, he said. House too. Just needs patience. The father blinked at him, uncertain. No one had spoken of the ranch with respect in a long time. The daughter studied him quietly. She saw the way his eyes lingered on the house, not with mockery, but with thought, as if he saw something beyond the ruin, something she herself had long believed. Stay for supper, she said softly. And so he did. That night, by lamplight, they shared bread and beans. The stranger spoke little of himself. A carpenter, he said, though he had wandered from town to town, taking work where he could. He had no family near, no land of his own. His words were plain, but there was steadiness in them, a kind of rootedness rare in men who drifted. The father warmed to him slowly. The daughter noticed more, the way he mended the hinge of the door without being asked, the way he listened when she spoke, the way he never once looked at her with pity or condescension. After supper, he walked the length of the house, running his hand over beams and boards, studying its bones. These walls hold, he murmured. There's more strength here than folk reckon. Just takes the right eyes to see it. The daughter's heart stirred at those words. For once, she was not the only one who saw. In the days that followed, the stranger lingered. He helped where he could, never asking coin, never pressing himself into their lives, but always there, steady as the earth beneath their boots. And it was he who first noticed. While replacing rotted boards inside the parlor, his hammer struck a hollow sound. Curious, he pried at the wood until a small panel came loose. Behind it, carved into the beam, were markings, strange symbols, initials, lines that seemed like part of a map. He showed the daughter. Her eyes widened, her breath catching. She traced the markings with her fingers, heart thundering. They were too deliberate to be chance, too hidden to be meaningless. Her mind flickered to the iron key she carried, hidden in her pocket. Could it be? Could her grandfather have left more than walls behind? The stranger met her gaze, and for a moment, there was no wind, no dust, no ruin, only the shared recognition that something long buried was waiting to be found. And so the broken house, once only a weight of shame, began to hum with a quiet promise. The laughter of the town still rang in their ears. The first man still loomed with threats and smirks, but within the walls of that sagging ranch, a secret waited. And for the first time, they were not alone in believing it. The house had been speaking for weeks now, not with words, but with sighs of old wood, with shadows cast at strange angles, with secrets tucked into its very bones. The daughter felt it each night as she lay awake, the iron key heavy in her apron pocket, the stranger's steady presence a quiet reassurance nearby. It was on a late afternoon, with the air thick and hot, that the true whisper came. The father had set himself to repairing the parlor floor where years of boots had worn it thin. The stranger worked beside him, their hammers ringing like a pair of solemn bells. The daughter knelt nearby, sorting nails, her fingers black with dust. Then thunk, not the solid thud of hammer meeting wood, but something hollower, deeper. The father paused, brows furrowed. He struck again. Thunk. The stranger met his gaze, silent but knowing. Together, they pried at the boards until one lifted with a long groan. Beneath it lay a cavity, small but deliberate, as though hands long ago had carved it with care. The daughter leaned close, her breath caught in her throat. Inside rested a chest, iron-banded, its wood darkened with age. It was no bigger than a saddlebag, yet heavy with mystery. Dust clung to its edges, and the lock at its front bore the faintest outline of a keyhole. Her fingers flew to her pocket. The iron key, the one she had carried like a secret prayer. The father's hands trembled as he lifted the chest free. The daughter knelt beside it, slipping the key into the lock. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold still. Then, click, the lid creaked open. Inside lay papers first, bundles of them, bound with string. Maps faded with time, lines etched in her grandfather's careful hand. Letters, some addressed to her father, never given, their ink smudged with age. Among them, wrapped in oilskin, was a small pouch. When a stranger placed it in her palm, it was heavy. She loosened the ties, and gold coins spilled into her hand, glimmering even in the dim light. Not many, but enough to matter. But it was not the coins that silenced the room. It was the papers. Among them was a deed, signed and sealed, granting rights to water that ran beneath the land. Not dry land, after all, but land with veins of life hidden just below the surface. A wellspring waiting to be tapped, a resource worth more than cattle or coin. The daughter's eyes shone as she read aloud, her voice trembling with both awe and vindication. The father sank into a chair, head in his hands. Relief and grief mingled in him. Relief that his father had not left them nothing, grief that he had doubted so long. The stranger leaned against the wall, his gaze steady, his lips curved in the faintest smile. He had suspected the house held more than ruin, but even he had not guessed the depth of it. News in the West travels faster than dust on the wind. By the next week, whispers had spread through town. The old ranch house, worthless, mocked, was sitting on water rights. Precious, rare water in a land that burned with thirst. The townsfolk who had laughed now muttered differently. Envy in their eyes, curiosity in their steps. Men who had once smirked now tipped hats with forced politeness. Women who had whispered now spoke in tones laced with false sweetness. But none watched more closely than the first man. He rode up one morning, his horse gleaming, his smile sharper than ever. He leaned on their fence once more, but his tone carried no humor now, only calculation. Quite a find, he drawled. Reckon that deed might not be as solid as you think. Folks might contest it. A lot of men been eyeing that land a long time. The father's jaw set. The daughter met his gaze without flinching. It's ours, she said, and it'll stay ours. The man's smile widened, but did not reach his eyes. We'll see. He rode away, leaving the air heavy with unspoken threat. But for the daughter, the discovery was more than proof, more than wealth. It was vindication. All the laughter, all the whispers, all the pity, they no longer held her in chains. She walked through town with her head high now, the papers safe in her satchel, her spirit burning bright. The father began to change too. He stood taller, his voice carried more strength. For the first time in years, pride returned to his step. The stranger remained close, his presence steady, his hands always willing. He spoke little, but his actions filled the silence, mending, hauling, advising when asked. The daughter felt his gaze on her sometimes, not in ownership, not in pity, but in recognition, as though he saw her not as the townsfolk saw, but as she truly was. One evening, after long work, they stood together on the porch, the sky awash with twilight. The stranger's voice came low, almost hesitant. "Your grandfather, he left more than land. He left faith. That's rarer than gold." The daughter looked at him, then truly looked. His face was worn by travel, his hands rough with labor, but his eyes held the kind of quiet steadiness a soul could rest against. Her heart stirred in a way it had not before. Not quick, not wild, but slow and deep, like roots growing unseen beneath the soil. Still, the discovery did not end the struggle. The first man pressed harder. He spread rumors in town, claiming the deed was forged, the papers false. He spoke to lawyers, twisted words, sought to undermine their claim. But the daughter refused to yield. She walked into the heart of town, into the square where once she had been whispered about, and stood tall before them all. She spoke not with anger, but with calm fire. She told of her grandfather's hand, of his belief in the land, of the truth hidden beneath their laughter. She held the deed aloft, her voice carrying like the toll of a bell. Some turned away, ashamed. Others looked on with awe. Even those who had mocked her most could not deny the strength in her eyes. The first man stood at the edge, his face tight, his pride wounded. He said nothing, but his silence was a storm brewing. That night, the daughter sat again with her journal by lamplight. She wrote not of ruin now, but of rising. She wrote of the ranch as it would be, as it was becoming. She wrote of her father's renewed pride, of the stranger's quiet loyalty, of her own heart that no longer trembled beneath scorn. When she closed the book, she pressed her hand against the iron key once more. It had opened more than a chest. It had opened a future. And yet, in the shadows of the room, she knew the fight was not over. The first man would not let pride lose so easily. But neither would she. The house no longer groaned like a dying man. It breathed now, slow, steady, alive. Its wounds were not gone, but they were healing. Within its walls, laughter had begun to return. Not the laughter of mockery from town, but the soft laughter of family around a table, the kind that stitched wounds closed. And beneath it all, the land whispered, a steady hum of promise. Water waiting, life waiting. The seed her grandfather had planted finally breaking the soil. The daughter stepped outside into the night. The stars burned bright overhead, scattered like spilled salt across black velvet. The air was cool, fragrant with earth. Beside her, the stranger stood silent, his gaze on the same sky. She felt the closeness of him, not pressing, not demanding, just present, steady, like the land itself. For the first time in a long while, she felt not mocked, not small, but seen. And with that seeing, a new strength bloomed. The ranch was no longer just a burden. It was a legacy. It was a promise. It was theirs. The ranch was no longer silent. Its walls still creaked, its windows still bore cracks, but inside there was movement, purpose, the steady beat of life returning. The father walked with his shoulders straight again. The daughter carried herself like a flame unshaken, and the stranger's quiet presence filled spaces where once only sorrow had lived. But word of their inheritance, the deed, the water beneath their land, had spread too far. The first man could not bear it. To see those he had mocked now rise above him was a wound to his pride, and pride can be a cruel master. He began to circle like a wolf. Lawyers, papers, false claims. He whispered into ears that wanted to believe him, sowing doubt like weeds. Soon there were whispers in town again, not mocking this time, but suspicious. Maybe the girl's claim ain't true. Maybe the old man left nothing but forgeries. Maybe that stranger planted it all. The daughter heard it, felt it press against her spirit. But unlike before, she did not bend beneath it. She had been burned by laughter before and survived. She would not break now. The challenge came one evening in the town hall, when the first man arrived with papers in hand, his voice booming, demanding a hearing. He stood tall, his boots shining, his coat pressed, his arrogance dripping like oil. "This deed they wave around," he declared, "it's a trick, a fraud. That land was never theirs to claim." The room murmured, uneasy. The daughter stepped forward, calm though her heart thundered. She carried her grandfather's papers close against her chest, her hands steady. The father stood behind her, the stranger at her side. "This land is ours," she said, her voice clear. It was bought and worked by my grandfather's hands. His sweat fed it. His heart guarded it. And he left proof enough for any honest man to see. She laid the papers down before the council. The ink was faded, the edges worn, but the signatures were true, the seals unbroken. One by one, the elders leaned forward, their eyes tracing each line. The first man sneered. Old paper proves nothing. Words can be forged. Signatures copied. The stranger, who had remained silent all this time, finally spoke. His voice was steady, carrying through the hall. I've worked with it all my life. I know the grain of it like I know my own hand. That chest, those papers, they were sealed long before any of us were born. That deed is no trick. It's as true as the earth beneath our boots. Silence fell. Even the elders, cautious by nature, nodded slowly. The first man's face twisted, his pride slipping like a mask torn away. He opened his mouth to argue, but his words faltered. The room had already turned. The daughter stood taller, her eyes bright with a fire that could not be mocked, could not be doubted. For the first time, she was not the girl whispered about in corners. She was the granddaughter of a man whose legacy lived on, the keeper of a land that would endure. The first man left in silence, his boots striking hard against the floor, his pride more broken than the ranch had ever been. That night, the town square glowed with lantern light. People gathered not to laugh, but to listen. They looked at the daughter with new eyes, at the father with respect, at the stranger with curiosity. And when the daughter spoke, it was not only for herself, but for all who had ever been mocked for believing in something unseen. You call it foolish, she said softly, but faith looks like foolishness until it blooms. My grandfather planted roots deep in this land. We tended them, though you laughed. And now you see they were never dead. Her words carried, not loud, but steady, and they settled into the hearts of those listening like seeds dropped into soil. Back at the ranch, the father walked the land with new eyes. He felt the earth beneath him, alive with promise. Plans began to take shape, new wells, cattle to return, fences to stretch strong again. His shoulders, once heavy with shame, now carried hope. The daughter worked alongside him, her laughter returning, lighter now, freer. She wrote in her journal each night, her words no longer whispers of hope, but records of triumph. And the stranger, he remained, though he spoke little of why. Perhaps he had found what he was searching for. Perhaps he had only ever been searching for belonging. He worked, he mended, he built, and through it all he stayed by her side. Their bond grew not in sudden fire, but in slow-burning warmth, in shared work, in quiet looks, in the way her hand brushed his when passing tools, in the way his gaze softened when she spoke. Love did not announce itself. It simply was, rooted, steady, as much a part of the land as the rising sun. The ranch, once mocked, began to change. Windows patched, roof mended, fences straight. The land whispered louder now, humming with the promise of water below. Neighbors who once laughed now offered help, though their eyes carried shame for their cruelty. But the daughter did not hold bitterness. She had learned that mockery only matters if you believe it. She forgave, not for them, but for herself, for her freedom. One morning, she stood on the porch, the dawn rising in hues of gold and rose. The light caught the broken windows, making them blaze like jewels. The house, though scarred, looked almost holy in that moment, as if the years of suffering had been its own kind of prayer. The father stepped beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Your grandfather will be proud," he said. His voice was thick, but his eyes shone. She smiled softly. He always knew. He just waited for us to see. The stranger joined them then, silent, his presence enough. Together they watched the sun climb, the land waking with it, and in that stillness, the ranch no longer felt broken. It felt alive, and so it ended, not with the roar of gunfire, not with the violence of vengeance, but with the quiet victory of dignity. The mockers had fallen silent. The proud had been humbled. The house once scorned now stood as proof that patience and faith can outlast cruelty. And in the heart of it all was a daughter who had refused to bow her head, a father who found his pride again, and a stranger who saw in them what others could not. The narrator's voice softens, as if speaking directly across the firelight to the listener. Remember this, friends. The world will laugh at what it cannot see. It will mock what it cannot understand. But sometimes the truest treasures lie hidden in places everyone else overlooks. And those who are willing to believe, to endure, to keep tending the soil even when mocked, they are the ones who will one day harvest. If this tale of a rancher, his daughter, and a house that rose again touched your heart, I'd ask you to linger a little longer. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me where in this wide world you're watching from. And if you'd like to hear more stories whispered like this one, about faith and love and the quiet triumphs of the Wild West, do subscribe. Every story keeps the fire burning, and every voice around it matters.